We are here today to examine illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing by the People's Republic of China. What we're dealing with is a state-backed system run by the Chinese Communist Party that combines illegal fishing, market manipulation, some of the worst environmental standards on oceans in the world, gray fleets that don't abide by any international treaties, and forced labor, all in one supply chain. And it's happening at scale, what we call IUU fishing. This system has real consequences for American workers, for law-abiding American fishermen, particularly in my state, the great state of Alaska, and for the integrity of the entire global seafood market. The PRC has built the world's largest distant water fishing fleet. These vessels do not simply compete, they overwhelm, and as China always does, they cheat. They show up in other countries' waters. Hundreds, if not thousands, of these gray fleet vessels. They push into exclusive economic zones where they're not supposed to be. They ignore quotas and environmental standards. They transship and relabel the catch to hide its origin. And they use forced labor, slave labor. This is not fair competition. Alaska fishermen can't compete against slave labor. It is a strategy of economic coercion that has direct consequences here at home, but also overseas. My state I like to refer to as the superpower seafood. We produce over 60% of the wild-caught seafood in the United States, commercial, subsistence, sport. In Alaska, we have some of the best managed fisheries in the world. We certainly have challenges like bycatch, but our fishermen generally follow the law. They respect environmental standards. They manage sustainably. They are very focused on preserving resources for future generations. Alaska fishermen, American fishermen, should not be forced to compete against gray fleets from China that disregard rules, benefit from state subsidies, flood global markets with cheap products tied to illegal practices, all the while destroying fish stocks through trawling and other operations in the high seas. Again, this is not fair competition. And it gets worse. There's credible evidence that parts of the PRC seafood supply chain involve forced labor, slave labor, including Uyghur labor and North Korean labor in seafood processing. North Koreans and Indonesians and others are also being used on Chinese fishing boats in conditions that resemble slave labor. So when we talk about IUU fishing, we are not just talking about resource theft and environmental degradation. We are talking about a system in which illegal fishing, hidden sourcing, labor exploitation, market distortion, and horrendous environmental standards for sustainable ocean fisheries are all connected. This should concern all of us. Then add Russia to this mix. Russian seafood can be processed in China, relabeled, and then pushed back into global markets. This undermines sanctions and further distorts prices. It should not be possible, but it is happening now as we speak. This is a serious problem, and it deserves serious attention. Fortunately, we are beginning to act. I weighed in extensively with the Trump administration to communicate how much Alaska fishermen need to continue a comprehensive ban on Russian seafood imports into the United States. Russia banned the importation of American seafood in 2014. We have not been able to export one fish to Russia since 2014. You want to talk about an unlevel playing field? So we were able to get a ban on Russian seafood into the United States. And when they tried to launder their seafood through China, we clamped down on that as well. I was happy to see the Trump administration renew that ban just a few weeks ago to help maintain and strengthen federal measures, ensure a level playing field against Russia, and to promote Alaska and American fishermen and coastal communities that support them. Congress has also begun to respond. The Senate, 2 weeks ago, unanimously passed my Fighting Foreign Illegal Seafood Harvest Act, the FISH Act. This is an effort, a comprehensive effort, that I've been working on for many years with my friend and colleague, Senator Sheldon Whitehouse from Rhode Island, that recognizes the huge threat of IUU fishing, not just as an environmental issue, but as an economic issue, a labor issue, a national security issue. When Senator Whitehouse and I were at the Munich Security Conference, not this year, but last year and the year before, the AFRICOM commander, the 4-star Marine general in charge of U.S. AFRICOM, the combatant command for AFRICOM, he met with a bunch of senators saying the number one national security issue he's dealing with right now is IUU fishing from China off the coast of Africa, if you can believe that. So this is an issue that combines national security, forced labor, human trafficking, environmental degradation, sustainable oceans, all wrapped up in one. So our FISH Act is the most comprehensive enforcement effort to combat IUU fishing in the history of the Congress. And it passed in a unanimous way in the United States Senate. So we're hoping our House colleagues will get that one over the goal line soon, and I'm confident that we will. Congress also passed, and the President signed into law, a provision that I included in the NDAA last year, barring the Pentagon from selling or procuring any Chinese seafood imports into our commissaries or military dining facilities. Our servicemen and women and their families should not be eating communist fish. We should be eating freedom fish from Alaska in America. And we were able to start an important way in which to do that. I'm pretty darn sure Chinese military members are not eating great wild Alaskan salmon. So we shouldn't be eating their fish, especially given how it's harvested. I've also been the leading advocate for elevating the role of seafood within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And I'm very honored to announce, just yesterday, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Interior, the Secretary of Commerce, and the NEC Chairman, Kevin Hassett, and I announced the USDA Office of Seafood Policy. This is something I've been working on for 10 years, and they finally did it, to enable the farmers of the sea, our great American fishermen, to have many of the same benefits that our farmers have from USDA, and have the White House fully coordinate American seafood policy. In our press conference and roundtable yesterday with many American fishermen throughout the country, we talked a lot about the issues we are going to be focused on in this hearing. But it's progress. It's progress. If illegal seafood can be still caught in one place, processed in another, relabeled, and sold in the United States, then we have significant gaps to close. If we withhold release orders from customs, are not being brought robustly, if traceability remains incomplete, and if import controls are still too easy to circumvent, then bad actors will continue to exploit these weaknesses. And that is why this hearing matters. We need to understand more fully where our enforcement tools are working, where they are falling short, in what more should be done. I'm particularly interested in hearing from our experts today on the utility of tools like the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. That was a bill Chairman Smith, Senator Rubio, now our Secretary of State, got passed into law that banned the importation of products from China that use Uyghur forced labor. One of my questions today will be, if the Chinese are using forced labor for fisheries, why are we allowing any fish from China into the United States? Not just the fish going to our commissaries and military dining facilities. Senator Merkley and I have introduced a bill to follow on that, the Uyghur Genocide Accountability and Sanctions Act, that reinforces some of these provisions. As it moves through the process, maybe there's more we can do with it. We're certainly open to suggestions from our witnesses. At this time, this is not a challenge the United States faces alone. Countries around the world are dealing with the same tactics, as I mentioned, African countries, Latin American countries, the same coercive patterns, the same gray fleet, Chinese fleets that ravage the ocean, the same difficulty of enforcing rules against these fleets that operate with scale and in the shadows. So we need to work with our partners to improve enforcement capacity and increase the cost of this illegal IUU behavior. Though China's IUU fishing is a global and complex problem, at the end of the day, the principle here is simple. If you're engaged in illegal fishing, if you are exploiting workers, if you are using slave labor, if you are hiding all of these things, then you should not have access to the American market, period. That should be the standard. If we banned all Russian seafood, which we have, why shouldn't we also ban all Chinese seafood, which we should? This hearing is an opportunity to expose the Chinese IUU fishing system that impacts more than just sustainable and healthy oceans. It's a human trafficking racket. It is an opportunity to identify where our policies need to be stronger, and we make clear that the United States intends to defend lawful producers, uphold human rights, and enforce the laws, particularly from the chairman and Senator, now Secretary Rubio. I want to thank our witnesses for helping bring transparency to what is designed to stay hidden. And I want to introduce them because we have an expert panel. Ian Urbina is the founder and director of the Outlaw Ocean Project, a Washington, D.C. based nonprofit journalism organization that investigates human rights, environmental and labor abuses across the world's oceans. Before launching the project, he spent nearly 17 years as a staff reporter for the New York Times. His work has earned numerous awards. His New Yorker articles and political articles were exceptional, and I've cited them many times in testimony. His awards include a Pulitzer Prize, 2 George Polk Awards, and an Emmy. This is journalism at its finest and most important. Rear Admiral Scott Clendenin has served 33 years on active duty in the U.S. Coast Guard and retired as Assistant Commandant for Response Policy, where he oversaw operational policy across 7 mission areas. He spent 14 years at sea on 6 Coast Guard cutters, commanded 4 of them, and led international multi-mission patrols involving narcotics interdiction, fisheries enforcement, mass migration response, search and rescue, and disaster response. Ashore, he held senior intelligence and policy roles, supporting national operations and interagency efforts. He is a 1990 graduate of the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. And finally, the Honorable Dean Pinkert, who is an international trade and human rights lawyer and consultant who serves as a special advisor to Corporate Accountability Lab. He spent 10 years as a commissioner at the International Trade Commission, including 2 as the vice chairman. He has testified before Congress and has written and spoken widely on trade policies, including U.S. efforts to prevent the importation of goods produced by forced laborers. I want to welcome the witnesses, and I want to hear from our co-chairman on his opening statement. Then we look forward to the statements from our witnesses. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your extraordinary leadership on the Fish Act. I've been in Congress now 46 years, and very often, because of the filibuster and of the unbelievable power one member has to stop a bill, and you were able to navigate, overcome just tremendous odds to get this piece of legislation passed by the House. It will pass in the Senate. I mean, it will pass in the House. I've already talked to the chairman that you have continually talked to, Bruce Westerman, who's a great chairman, and he's all in. He's had his hearing himself, but you did, and people have to know this. The nearly impossible, because there would be a hold on this bill, and I know that 4 or 5 people who would have done it, and you navigated that just brilliantly, and I want to thank you for that. The bill passes, I think people know, unanimously, and again, it's comprehensive. It is a historic, landmark piece of legislation to combat foreign, illegal, unreported, and unregulated IUU fishing. The Sullivan Fish Act will blacklist offenders from U.S. ports, bolster the U.S. Coast Guard's enforcement capabilities, and advances international and bilateral negotiations to achieve enforceable agreements. And again, we will just back your leadership in the House and get this over the finish line and signed by the President. Let me also say, too, your amendment that you got into the NDAA to ban the purchase of these products by our commissaries, the PXs. We had written the Biden administration, and that would be Marco Rubio and I, frequently saying all of the agencies of government who buy fish, and we're the biggest purchaser of fish in the world, how could we be doing that when it is being made with forced labor in violation of the Uyghur Act as well as the Uyghur Human Rights Act? And we get crickets. You know, they didn't do a thing. You now put it into law, and I can't say how grateful all of us are for your extraordinary leadership. It's just amazing, and it's going to make the difference. And I do hope your constituents know, because in addition to being a fundamental human rights issue, it also is a great issue for your fishermen. I have many in my state of New Jersey. They can't compete against unfair trading of that kind, where you force people to be on these boats. And again, Ian, at great risk to his investigators, and I mean great risk, being on the boats themselves, we're able to expose this, and yet we really, until your law, and it's going to be a law, we got nothing. You know, we got a lot of, oh, wow, that's something. But nobody would say, let's really do something. And again, 4 years of the Biden administration, crickets. They wouldn't do it. And I can't tell you how upset I am with that. At our commission hearing in 2023, we did hear from Ian, who did a tremendous job. And I like the way you said, you know, outstanding leadership in the journalistic side. You have shown us outstanding legislative leadership, Mr. Chairman, to get this legislation passed by the U.S. Senate. But we did have a hearing. We called it From Bait to Plate, How Forced Labor in China Taints America's Seafood Supply Chain. And across the board, whether it be calamari or wherever it might be, we're talking about a highly tainted industry with forced labor. And, you know, nobody like Xi Jinping does forced labor as horribly and as egregiously as he does. And of course, the whole industry now has been tainted. And again, Ian, you're the one who broke the story in all this. We did, you know, I want to thank you. I do have a long statement, but we do want to get to our witnesses. And I would ask that unanimous consent to be made a part of the record. But I can't thank you enough, Mr. Chairman. I mean, this is leadership. I hope people realize that, how hard it is to get a human rights bill passed in the United States Senate, and you've achieved it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It was a team effort. Senator Whitehouse, I think, is going to show up here in a little bit. And he was my partner on this. And Congressman, do you have an opening statement at all, or do you want to say anything?
Well, Mr. Chairman, it's an honor to be back again with each of you. Thank you all for being here today. Our witnesses, this is a very distinguished group that is before this committee. You think about this, China's illegal fishing practices and forced labor systems on the United States is totally unacceptable. Alabama's red snapper fishery is one of the most well-managed and profitable in the Gulf, yet our local fishermen are forced to compete with cartel-backed poachers and subsidized foreign fleets that ignore conservation standards. And I think that right there is working against America, and I just commend both of you, especially because this wasn't an easy fight. But I think we're going definitely in the right direction. For for your experience, how does we've got questions later, just in this opening statement. I just want to commend both of you for this, and we'll roll with questions later. But I thank each of you for being here, and Ian, I thank you for your hard work. Not an easy lift that you went through, but I can tell you the world saw it. There's no doubt, and I thank each of you for being here. Mr. Chairman?
Thank you. So we're going to begin, speaking of forced labor, with a very quick video, and then we're going to turn to the testimony of our... Oh, after. Okay. Actually, we will start with the testimony of our three distinguished witnesses, and then we'll wrap that with a short video, and then we will have questions from the panel. It's good to see Senator Kim here as well. And you want to say anything? Okay. But why don't we begin? I've already introduced our witnesses. Again, three distinguished witnesses. I want to begin with Ian Urbina, who's done such a great job on the Outlaw Ocean Project, and hear from him. You have 5 minutes for an opening statement, and if you wish to submit a longer written statement for the record, we will certainly accept that. Mr. Urbina.
Thank you for that. And I'll try to make the 5-minute deadline. I'll read fast.
That's all right. I didn't make my 5 minutes. There's a lot to say here.
Thank you, Chair Sullivan, Co-Chair Smith, and the rest of the Commission for inviting me to speak. It's an honor to be back before you. Last time I was here was in 2023 when the Commission asked me to testify about an investigation by my news team, the Outlaw Ocean Project, into China's role in global seafood. That reporting focused on China's more than 6,500 industrial fishing vessels and its hundreds of processing plants. It documented debt bondage, passport confiscation, avoidable deaths, fatal beatings, trafficked workers, illegal fishing, and a state-coordinated program forcing thousands of workers from Xinjiang and North Korea into seafood processing plants. Much of the product from those plants was bound for the U.S., including U.S. military bases and congressional cafeterias, in violation of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA, and the equivalent law tied to North Korean labor known as CATSA. In the wake of that reporting, Congress, the executive branch, and a small handful of seafood companies took action. I'm here today to discuss our current investigation, which will be published in the coming weeks, and which examines the global aquaculture industry, including China's role in it. By way of context, seafood is the world's most heavily traded food commodity by value, and aquaculture, or fish farming, is the industry's fastest growing sector. As of 2022, more than half of all seafood worldwide was farmed rather than caught at sea. This growth has been driven in part by a marketing claim that fish farming is sustainable because it reduces pressure on wild fisheries. The problem is that for much of the industry, that claim is false. Roughly 2/3 of global aquaculture depends on feed made from wild-caught fish in the form of fish meal and fish oil. Think of seafood people eat most, so salmon, shrimp, tilapia, sea bream. In other words, many farmed fish are fed the very wild fish the industry claims it's helping to spare. Not all aquaculture works this way. Roughly 1/3 of global fish farming focuses on non-fed species, such as clams, oysters, mussels. That form of aquaculture can indeed be sustainable. But most fish farming depends on fed fish. And our investigation found that this segment of the industry prefers to begin the story of sustainability and ethical sourcing at the farm. If you start the story earlier, however, with the feed, a very different picture emerges. Our recent investigation, called Food for Feed, did just that. Over the past 2 years, we mapped and reported on roughly 1,400 fish meal plants worldwide. We boarded and inspected ships supplying them. We traced the farms to which the feed goes, and we tracked the resulting seafood. Our goal was to document the hidden costs of fish farming. In Russia's Far East, we found forced labor on ships, farms, and in factories. In Western Sahara, we revealed the industry helping prop up Morocco's military occupation. In Gambia and Mauritania, we discovered fish that once fed local communities increasingly diverted into fishing oil factories for export, worsening food insecurity. In countries including India and Peru, the industry was tied to at least 80 incidents of civil unrest, some quite violent, often labor strikes and community protests over polluted water and stench from factories cooking thousands of tons of decomposing fish. These are what economists call externalities, costs pushed onto distant countries and communities while wealthier consumers enjoy the luxury seafood produced as a result. So what does any of this have to do with China? China is the largest producer, exporter, and consumer of seafood in the world. It's also the single biggest exporter of seafood to the United States. And it is rapidly expanding fish farming, so it does not have to send so many vessels onto the high seas or into foreign waters. China now grows about 4 times as much fish as it catches, and huge quantities of that farmed seafood are exported, including to the United States. What's striking is where much of this expansion is happening: Xinjiang and Tibet. Fish farming typically takes place elsewhere in the world, along coasts, in nearshore cages or pens. But China is expanding it in mountainous and desert regions that are among the most landlocked places on Earth. Our investigation mapped the supply chains of more than 1,200 fish farms in Xinjiang and Tibet. We found seafood from these farms going to dozens of countries, including the US, and to companies supplying public institutions such as military bases, public schools, and congressional cafeterias. Not only is that a violation of the UFLPA, but some of these farms in Xinjiang are certified as sustainable by US-based programs such as Best Aquaculture Practices, which seems mystifying in light of the US law. I do not need to remind this commission that Tibet and Xinjiang are among the most repressive regions in China. In Tibet, the government has relocated roughly 500,000 people, leveling villages and monasteries for projects including hydroelectric dams and fish farms. In Xinjiang, more than 1 million people have been held in detention camps while the government has carried out large-scale land seizures, forced sterilizations, and criminal penalties for speaking native languages or practicing religious and cultural traditions. That seafood from these regions is still reaching the United States shows how much work remains. American seafood producers, grocers, and food service companies such as Cisco continue to rely on certification schemes that claim to police sustainability and forced labor in places like China, where spot checks at factories, ships, or farms are effectively impossible. China is also a place where asking tough questions about Uyghurs, Tibetans, or human rights generally can get a company, civil society group, or journalists expelled. Yet the cost savings are so enticing that industry and certifiers and journalists continue to make that Faustian bargain. Let's be clear. Repression in these regions is one of China's hidden costs. It is the externality that helps produce cheap seafood. It is part of China's competitive advantage and helps explain the trade surplus in this commodity. The UFLPA was enacted partly to level that playing field. So were tools like the Global Magnitsky Act. Customs and Border Protection have used withhold release orders to stop imports suspected of being tied to forced labor. Congress has pressed companies through letters and hearings like this one and tightened purchasing rules for federally funded institutions. Congress has also, in rare cases, forced companies to do due diligence, putting the burden on industry rather than on journalists or civil society groups to prove that supply chains are free of illegal or unethical hidden costs. The bottom line then is this: the tools exist. The question now is whether they'll get used. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ian. And I'm going to call an audible here and have Senator Whitehouse say a few opening statement lines before we turn to our other witnesses. Senator Whitehouse.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate you allowing me to interrupt the proceedings with a statement. You and I have worked together on the Fish Act, which has recently passed the Senate by unanimous consent, and which I believe has the support of the Trump administration, at least the Department of State, and which has cleared in the past all of its house obstacles at one time or another. So I think we're in a good place to get it across the finish line at last. It addresses the problem of the international pirate fleet, which exists in a shadowy world of shell corporations and false flags. It is a machine of exploitation, both of common resources like international fisheries and of human beings. Many of the pirate fleet vessels qualify as slave ships by any rational definition of that term. And the Chinese fishing fleet, which has its own set of problems. The first of which is that it's not just a fishing fleet. If you have any doubts about that, go to the recent New York Times article that had an interactive display of the geolocation of the Chinese fishing fleet deployed in the Pacific, in the sort of South China Sea area, and they were spread all over the place, and suddenly they all moved to create a strategic line across the sea. That was not ordinary fishing behavior. I went to an oceans conference in an island nation, and there was a Chinese fishing ship anchored or in still just offshore. I don't know if it was anchored or just holding position. It was not engaged in anything that looked like fishing behavior, but a lot of diplomats and people had come to that place for that conference, and I suspect that this vessel was trying to pick up whatever signals they could to find out what was going on among the people at that conference. So they're not just fishing, and we should be aware of that. When they are fishing, they're also a danger because they behave horribly with respect to fisheries. We heard about this for quite a long time. Mr. Urbino, your work on this has been good, thank you. But particularly, it came in a meeting at the Munich Security Conference where the four-star general in charge of AFRICOM, without provocation by me, said, one of the things we need to do to be more effective in my command is to provide resources to our coastal partner nations to help them better understand when somebody is fishing illegal in their waters, who is fishing illegally in their waters, and maybe even give them some resources to go out and challenge the illegal fishing in their waters. Because the Chinese fishing fleet is going through other nations' economic zones and just shredding the fisheries. When I used to travel in Asia with Senator McCain, pretty much everywhere we stopped that was a coastal nation, when we had our major meeting with the head of state, and I asked about how things going with the Chinese fishing fleet, their heads practically exploded. Everybody had a story about abuses, damage, violent behavior, threatening behavior by the Chinese fishing fleet. So we have an enormous amount of work to do. The recent High Seas Treaty, I think, is a help. It would be great if we could join that. In the meantime, the Fish Act is going to be really important. What it does is it encourages investigations and sanctions and blacklisting of the bad behavior in these fleets. And in addition to thanking Senator Sullivan for his partnership in the Fish Act, I also want to thank him for bringing us together repeatedly with Deputy Secretary of State Landau, who has become a convert, having heard from Dan and me about this subject, and who I think is increasingly making it a State Department priority. So I'm delighted that these witnesses are here. For far too long, the pirate fishing fleet and the Chinese fishing fleet have been allowed to do untold damage in not only international waters, but also in unenforced sovereign waters. And the quicker we put an end to it, the better off we all will be. My Rhode Island fishermen and your Alaska fishermen will be well served when the international fisheries are less pressured by illegal fishing, leaving more for them to catch under law. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Senator Whitehouse. Thank you for your leadership and partnership on these issues. We'll now return to our expert witnesses. Admiral, floor is yours.
Well, distinguished members of the commission, I greatly appreciate the invitation to testify on this mission, which is just a very deep passion of mine. And a lot of my comments will affirm the excellent introduction of the commission to this topic. Illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing, is not just a conservation problem alone. It is a national security and food security issue that fuels global conflict. While other nations have large, distant IUU fishing fleets, as has been said here, China has by far the largest and has deployed it in a deliberate strategy to dominate the global seafood supply. Its distant water fishing fleets operate in the waters of over 90 countries, often with state subsidies. IUU fishing fleets practice AIS manipulation and transshipments at sea to launder their illegal catch. They take critical fishing resources from countries in the Indo-Pacific, West Africa, and South America, where their fisheries are critical for their needed subsistence. They build dependencies and are responsible for human rights abuse at sea through forced labor, as we've discussed here. Admiral Pamparo, Commander Indo-PACOM, noted that 8 of the 10 worst IUU fishing violators in the world are state-owned enterprises of the PRC, and they are a real driver of conflict in his AOR. China also uses fishing fleets as maritime militia in gray zone operations, creating what amounts to regional conflict through the proxy of coast guards and fishing fleets. Between 2011 and 2024, the Indo-Pacific saw 156 conflicts tied to fishing competition, and fisheries-related conflicts have increased 20-fold since the 1970s. IUU fishing is a vector for other transnational crime, including narcotic smuggling. Turning to the U.S. economy, the seafood sector, has been discussed here, is worth over $320 billion and employs 2.3 million Americans. Yet 75 to 85% of our seafood consumed in America is imported, directly exposing us to IUU-tainted supply chains. As the President's recent EO on fisheries stated, this is unfair to our very well-regulated fishing industry, just as was discussed here. Estimates suggest up to 1/3 of wild-caught seafood consumed in the United States is linked to illegal fishing. This is the seafood on American dinner tables. So what can be done? I recommended 3 strategic shifts that are detailed in my written testimony. I'll be very brief here to summarize them. First, we should reinvigorate American maritime governance to counter IUU fishing. As a start, this issue should be treated with the same seriousness as we treat narcotic smuggling and piracy. Congress's MSAFE Act is the best U.S. initiative to counter IUU fishing to date. However, their work needs to be elevated strategically in importance and fully funded. Despite years of effort, they have had minimal impact on the tide of IUU fishing globally. Second, we need to protect America's maritime interests through alliances and trade. Regional fisheries management organizations have forged through diplomatic compromise, where any member can block enforcement measures. That needs to evolve. We have proven that coordinated international operations, broad intelligence sharing, and collective diplomatic pressure can change IUU fleet behavior. U.S. trade negotiations are a critical instrument as well. All this needs to be consistently done at scale. Third, we need to strengthen public-private partnerships, developing a whole-of-society effort. As an example, in collaboration with the seafood industry, we need to improve seafood traceability and import controls that require documented legal origin for seafood entering U.S. markets. As another example, Operation Jade Spear showed what is possible when law enforcement, customs, Department of War, regulatory actions, and the financial sector are combined and resulted in the delisting of IUU-linked companies from NASDAQ. However, that was but one operation. To be effective, these types of operations must be replicated at scale. The opportunity before this Congress is to reframe our counter-IUU effort as a strategic national security and food security imperative that it is. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Admiral. Mr. Pickert?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I thank the Commission for the opportunity to testify on one of the most urgent tasks in U.S. trade enforcement, enhancing efforts to address systematic use of forced labor in China's seafood industry. As you indicated, Mr. Chairman, I am Special Advisor to Corporate Accountability Lab, or CAL, a human rights nonprofit organization in Chicago. CAL is active in petitioning U.S. Customs and Border Protection for forced labor import bans under Section 307 of the Tariff Act of 1930. China is the world's largest seafood producer and exporter, as was indicated in prior testimony, supplying a substantial share of the fish and shellfish reaching American consumers. There's a documented state practice of using Uyghur and other minority group workers under coercive conditions in Chinese seafood production. Goods produced under these conditions enter U.S. commerce at a price advantage underwritten by human suffering. Congress has assembled a flexible toolkit of legislation that can be used to address this problem, including Section 307, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, or UFLPA, Section 1595A civil penalties, and Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. The issue is not an absence of statutory authority. It is the failure to use these tools at scale, in combination, and with the creativity the circumstances demand. Now, Section 307 prohibits the importation of goods produced in whole or in part by forced labor, and the UFLPA creates a rebuttable presumption that any goods mined, produced, or manufactured in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region or by entities on the UFLPA entity list are made with forced labor and are therefore inadmissible. These are powerful tools, but their effectiveness depends on, first, the U.S. government's ability to trace goods from point of harvest through processing to the port of entry, two, the Forced Labor Enforcement Task Force's, or FLETF's, ability to maintain a timely cadence of placing companies on the entity list, and three, the willingness of CBP to move under Section 307 directly when the UFLPA itself does not satisfy enforcement objectives. And I believe, Senator Sullivan, that this addresses the point that you made in your opening statement, that sometimes we've got to move over to the general enforcement rather than just the UFLPA. Chinese seafood supply chains are deliberately opaque. Fish caught in distant waters can be transshipped through intermediary ports, relabeled, commingled with locally sourced product, and re-exported to the United States. This can render conventional documentation-based compliance less than fully effective. CBP should therefore require positive traceability documentation, vessel-level catch certificates, processing facility records, and chain of custody statements for high-risk seafood species and sourcing regions. Importers who cannot provide this documentation should simply not be permitted U.S. Customs entry of their merchandise. Now, I mentioned very briefly about the entity list. I just want to underscore that the UFLPA entity list should be expanded, and the FLETF should devote particular attention in this regard to Chinese seafood processors, cold chain logistics firms, and fishing fleet operators. It's also very important that Section 1595A authorizes civil penalties for importations made contrary to law. Forced labor importations in violation of Section 307 fit precisely into this authorization, yet penalties are rarely imposed in the forced labor context, and their deterrent potential has largely gone unrealized. A robust Section 1595A enforcement program would provide two benefits that detentions alone cannot. First, penalties impose a financial cost on importers who have not self-policed their supply chains, and thereby create a direct economic incentive for upstream due diligence. Secondly, penalty provisions can generate evidence through CBP's demand for importer documentation and the importer's responses, documentation revealing supply chain structures otherwise hidden from regulators. And I hope, by the way, that we get to talk about the new regulations in China that seek to impose penalties on just that very kind of investigatory activity that's so important. Perhaps the most sophisticated challenge in this space is the practice of supply chain bifurcation. Companies maintaining nominally compliant product lines for export to the United States while continuing to use state-imposed forced labor in lines destined for other markets or sold domestically. Compliance, in other words, is purely performative. Section 301 authorizes the U.S. Trade Representative, or USTR, to investigate and respond to foreign acts, policies, or practices that are unreasonable or discriminatory and that burden or restrict U.S. commerce. A foreign government policy that induces companies to simulate compliance while preserving state-imposed forced labor in non-U.S. destined production is exactly the kind of state-implicated anti-competitive practice that Section 301 was designed to address. In short, it's harmful to U.S. producers. In conclusion, we have the legal tools to address forced labor in seafood supply chains, including where, as in China, it is an instrument of state policy. The myriad laws in this space are mutually reinforcing. When deployed with strategic coordination and resolve, they can impose meaningful costs on companies that seek to benefit from this egregious human rights violation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Pinkert, and I want to thank all the witnesses again. Excellent testimony. We are going to, before we turn to questions, we have a short video that will be indicative of some of the forced labor issues that we wanted to show at this hearing. So if we can do that, it puts a human face on modern slavery in the Chinese fishing fleet. So if we can run that video now.
Kondisi di atas kapal sangat buruk, bahkan kaptennya kasar. Saya bekerja keras siang malam, nggak ada liburnya. Tapi sama saya dilakukan tidak baik sama kaptennya. Bahkan saya sering ditonjok, bahkan saya dipecut pakai menglen untuk tarik ikan. Dan bukan cuma itu aja, bahkan setiap kali saya tamban, jaga setir, saya sering ditusukin jarum. Bahkan makanannya juga nggak layak untuk dimakan seperti makanan bebek. Dan bukan cuma saya doang yang dilakukan seperti itu. Dan dari situ saya bersatu sama teman-teman untuk minta pulang. Karena saya sering banget diperlakukan seperti itu. Bahkan bekas tusukan saya sempat kena infeksi sampai keluar nanah, bahkan bengkak. Untuk berjalan aja saya susah. Dan dari situ saya bersatu sama teman-teman untuk minta pulang, izin sama kapten. Terus kapten tidak mengizinkan saya untuk pulang sama rekan-rekan. Dan pada akhirnya saya sama teman-teman sepakat untuk mogok kerja biar saya bisa dipulangkan. Dan dari situ saya izin lagi sama kapten untuk dipulangkan ke Indonesia. Terus pada saat itu akhirnya kapten mengizinkan saya untuk pulang selama 1 bulan kemudian.
Again, just an example of what our witnesses testified to, and some of the basic elements of the huge problem that we are facing here. I want to begin, Mr. Pinkert, I want to get your sense. It was very effective testimony on the authorities that we have. And I'm wondering from your perspective, we've banned the importation of Russian seafood. That's through executive order. As I mentioned in my opening statement, the Trump administration recently reauthorized that executive order. I've been working on this issue for many, many years. We finally got it done. We had a lot of American importers who were relying on Russian seafood who were fighting this measure. And they said this was going to hurt them. And what it actually ended up doing when it finally went into effect is it had a positive impact on American fishermen, because they said, well, I can't afford to not source my fish from Russia. And when I had discussions with these guys, I said, well, sure you can. There's a great source. It's called American seafood from American fishermen. Now, the Chinese and Russians are famous not just for their abusive practices, but for dumping seafood into our markets. Really, really drove down price. So the benefit of banning the importation of Russian seafood, and then they tried to launder it through China, and we nailed that down, was that the importers in America started to say, well, I guess I should get it from the Alaskans who are catching freedom fish sustainably. So it's actually really benefited our fishermen across the country. So I have two questions related to that experience. One, just a warning, right? If you're an American importer of a lot of Chinese seafood and you're watching this hearing, I would start kind of looking at new supply chains, because I think your days are numbered. Because the goal here is to ban the importation of Russian seafood under the laws that you currently say exists in the authority. But I think our CBP officials are getting better at the issue of traceability because of all the good work they've done on implementing the ban on Russian seafood and then the laundered Russian seafood through China. They're getting quite good. But my question to you is, do you think, and should we, under current law, all the laws that you mentioned, should we be looking to implement a ban, not just on the bill that I got passed in the NDAA, which is banning the importation of Chinese seafood for military commissaries and military dining facilities, but the comprehensive ban on Chinese seafood? Do you think that, given current practices, given what you know, given what others have testified to and have provided evidence of, whether it's the Section 307, the UFLPA, Section 301, is there enough evidence and authority for a comprehensive ban on Chinese seafood into the United States under current law? Do you think we meet that standard? And do you think that CBP is gaining the ability, I know the traceability issues are challenging, but do you think the CBP is gaining the ability to implement such a ban, since they are currently doing it with Russia, and they're doing it quite effectively? And maybe I'll pose that to you first, but I think I can pose that question to all the witnesses.
So thank you, Senator, for that question. And I would start by saying I agree with you that the capabilities have improved dramatically just in the past 2 years, 2.5 years, when I've been watching it very, very carefully. But having said that, I think that the answer, and I kind of touched on your question in the testimony, the more aggressive use of withhold release orders by CBP, including regional withhold release orders, I think would go a long way toward addressing the concerns that you're expressing. I think that it's one thing to say we have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, and that has very specific triggers, and there's a rebuttable presumption, as you know, under the UFLPA. But more generally, can we use the Section 307 process to do regional withhold release orders in a way that doesn't hinge specifically on the use of Uyghur forced labor?
Okay, good. Admiral, do you have a view on this?
Yes, sir. I think more strategically, I would say I was a co-chair when early days of the MSAFE with my NOAA and State Department colleagues. Every time we had public comment, traceability was one of the #1 issues and suggestions that came up. I think
As a way to not take action, or what?
No, traceability had to be pursued and had to be implemented
Yeah.
and had to be part of our customs procedures. Our interagency partners, at that point, were not very aggressive with that as far as seafood.
Yeah.
And now they're getting, now it looks like they are forming around that.
I think they're getting much better, right?
They're getting much better,
The ban
but
on Russian seafood has been a comprehensive and not always easy to enforce, but I think they're actually doing a really good job.
yes, sir. And it does take resources, obviously, to make sure they have those, and it requires consistency across the board. And so I think if you read public opinion right now, there's still room to improve there. But I think we're moving in the right direction with that. I think we've done a good job on the southern border. I think as we look at the importation of things like this into the nation, there's some things that we can do to do better on that front.
So let me ask, Mr. Urbina, your testimony, you have expertise. How do you think we are doing? I want to kind of have in some ways, a follow-up from the great work you've done previously on the forced labor, on ships and processing facilities. And then to your testimony today, if there is a rebuttable presumption under the UFLPA on forced labor in certain parts of China, and you are going to publish something here very soon that shows there's enormous amounts of aquaculture going on in this part of China, which is your testimony reveals kind of makes no sense, right? You're not near an ocean. They're doing it probably because of the labor costs of using slave labor. So do you think that that's going to highlight again the potential to ban any aquaculture from China, given how much they produce in the Xinjiang province and other areas? And then if you want to comment on kind of an update from where you think we have been from your previous excellent reporting and what the law, from your perspective, demands that we do, given that there is a lot of slave labor, forced labor going on in the seafood supply chain directly from China.
I think on your first question about a China-wide ban, I don't have an answer, but I do have a restatement of the question in the sense that the UFLPA is a fairly circumscribed and effective tool, but there's also law that clearly says products tied to forced labor in general should not be coming into the U.S. And yet we have a place that produces a lot of products where that law is unenforceable because it's so opaque and impenetrable. To me, that's the simplification of the point you're making. If we have a law, but we can't enforce it vis-a-vis any products coming from one certain place because it's a black box, we can't do real audits, we can't check on the truthfulness of papers coming from that place, then there needs to be some strong action to fix that so that we can ensure the forced labor law that's in general is enforceable. How you do that is your job, but I think it needs to be much wider. I do think the genius in UFLPA is the element of rebuttable presumption, which shifts the burden off of the likes of us and even you and puts it back on those who are making money from this Faustian bargain and says, if you want to do business there, you need to prove that it is legal. We don't have to prove that it's illegal. So to me, that's a formula for moving forward. To your second question, how are things going? Dean has the best view. He's down in the weeds and watching these cases. My, kind of high altitude, removed view of how things are going in the last couple of years is there was a lot of action from you folks in Congress, thankfully, and executive branches sat up and took notice. there was a lot less action from within the industry in terms of solving. And many of the key players we identified as relying on North Korean or Uyghur labor changed their name and kept their address. And suddenly they were not on the list anymore. And so this sort of gimmickry is a very simple solution to get around the tools we have. And we did document that happening right after the reporting. But I do agree with you that Customs and Border and other agencies began figuring out how they need to take this more seriously and trying to staff up to enforce those tools better.
Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Chairman. Let me just ask a couple of questions. In 1992, Frank Wolf, Scott Flipsy, our chief of staff, who's behind me here, and I visited China. We went to Beijing prison number 1, where Tiananmen Square activists had been, unfortunately, about 40 of them were still there, incarcerated under slave-like conditions. And we were there to, in large part, to focus on forced labor. The fact that the Lao guy was producing unbelievably large numbers of products that were at all of our stores, Kmart, you name the place, you would find it. If you traced it back, you would all of a sudden say, oh my God, it was made by a activist or religious freedom prisoner of conscience, and totally against Smoot-Hawley, totally against our laws. And Clinton pushed this idea, because I held a whole series of hearings on it, that we had an MOU with China. So I looked at it carefully, asked a lot of hard questions, met with our people in Beijing embassy who were part of the enforcement, and they were like the Maytag repairmen. Remember that old commercial? They have no work to do because they just had no work to do. It was so flawed as an agreement. We would tell them when we suspected something, and then they would investigate and get back to us within about 60 days. We had trouble getting visas for people to go and investigate. So we actually had proof. We got socks, jelly shoes. Scott actually put some of those, where's behind me, some of those socks in his back pocket. We went to Customs and they put an import ban on anything coming out of that because we had actionable information. But other than that, the MOU was an absolute farce. The whole idea of proof of origin and trying to determine that has been a vexing problem, and rebuttable presumption has helped to a large extent, but not fully, to at least shift that paradigm in our favor and in the favor of exploited workforces. We've had hearings in this commission, as the chairman knows, where we focused on the fact that the so-called investigators for our big corporations were denied access when they go. They come back and they say, see, it's all good. We got a certification. So we asked the hard questions. In one case, they interviewed people who told them, with the communist minders sitting right there, the secret police, what was going on. You think you're going to say, there's no, they don't have bargaining rights, but there's no any kind of protections for workers. So my point is that origin, the exploitation of the workforce, we kid ourselves if we think, absent the Fish Act and other important, the Uyghur Forced Labor Act, very aggressively implemented, will ever stop Xi Jinping from dumping all of this slave-made goods on our shores. So I would ask you again. It's been a problem. The MOU again was, and they would come up. They being the Clinton leaders, the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights and Democracy and Labor and others, and say, "We've got this MOU," and I said, "Doesn't work. Quit using that as a false defense for your lack of due diligence to try to stop this." And I think we're now dealing, and when the chairman's bill becomes law, and I do believe it will become law, it will be the biggest game changer on this issue ever. The Uyghur Forced Labor Act is important. It had problems with de minimis, numbers, although that's been reduced. And they were gaming that big time, they being the Chinese Communist Party. And there's always the problem of are they suggesting it's coming from somewhere else. I would point out that the video we just watched and the lawsuit against Bumblebee is being undertaken pursuant to my law, the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which awaits fuller implementation even as we meet. But at least, and the judge, I just looked it up, Bashan, has denied Bumblebee's motion to dismiss, and that was good. She's a district judge, and hopefully that will proceed. I mean, exploiting people in plain sight. So certification procedures, we've got to do a better job on that. But again, the law will be there, I think, on the fish. There's also the issue of farm fish, which carry with it concerns about how healthy are farm fish. It's a very serious concern. I did not know till you just said it that there's 4 times the number of fish, farm fish, as they catch. I mean, that's a frightening statistic because it breeds sickness and a lot of other things that is underappreciated by so many. So I would ask you, maybe to elaborate on that. Let me also say too that's for an opening. We got tools. We need more tools, and I can't say enough. And I hope the people in Alaska, the people in New Jersey, the people in Rhode Island, and all the other places where fish are so important realize that this historic bill, soon to become law, by the chairman, is the game changer. Because China, and as you pointed out, Admiral, there's concerns about, and NORAD, the AFRICOM general pointed out as well, commander, that we're dealing with a nefarious fleet for other reasons too. Not only the way they're exploiting workers and undercutting anything that even comes close to free and fair types of trade, and completely violative of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. But this law will make all the difference in the world. Ian, if you want to, and again, I can't thank you enough for what you have done. I mean, when we met before the New Yorker article came out, you briefed our whole staff about how important it was. We coincided our hearing to try to amplify the message of what you and your investigators have done. Again, you're the great journalist, and you're the great lawmaker that have made all the difference on this issue, and I can't thank you enough. Ian?
Thank you. I would just touch on the TVPA and its importance, and also the importance of what's happening with that Bumblebee case.
Right.
It's a bit in the weeds, but that the judge rejected the argument by the company in that case, that the company was not liable for what happened to that guy that you saw because of the sort of shell game nature of how globalized product handoff happens now, that company couldn't possibly know what was going on the ship, and therefore that company shouldn't be held responsible for it. This is the sort of fundamental playbook maneuver of modern litigation when it comes to these cases, and it's problematic beyond seafood. And the judge in that case said, you were certified and participant in a shared program, and therefore you're clearly connected with what was coming off of that ship and what was going on the ship. Therefore, I'm not going to allow that argument to fly. This is important precedent, and should be watched very closely to see if that holds, because it will be the first big step toward making TVPA, your legislation, more enforceable, and connecting the entities that are really getting wealthy off of the forced labor that's way down the supply chain, and ensuring that these supply chains have accountability and responsibility all the way up to the ones who really care the most, which are the branded, profiting institutions. So I would only say that the law is very important, but the way it's being gamed in the courts is also really important, and that case could be a boon for better enforcement going forward.
Senator Kim.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Thank you, Congressman, for your leadership on this. I only have a couple minutes here before I have to run for votes, but I wanted to ask Mr. Urbina, if I wanted to just start with you. I mean, what you talked about in terms of the growth of the aquaculture industry in Xinjiang and in Tibet, I mean, it's very alarming, and I wanted to just get a little bit more sense from you, just what you see as motivating this. I mean, is it driven primarily by just the low costs of the forced labor, or are there other political considerations or other things of that nature?
It's a great question. It's not driven by a desire to cash in on forced labor. It's driven by a larger state-building agenda by the Chinese government. Very wise, very Chinese. It's one part. Look, there are 68,000 fish farms on the east coast of China. There are 1,200 in the western landlocked Tibet, Xinjiang. So it's a small percentage.
I see.
It's also the fastest growing. It's $500 million of export coming out of that region. And in the last 2 years, it's grown by 16%, more than anywhere else in the country. So while it's small, it's cutting edge. It's the tip of the spear. And it has a lot to do with two big motivations. One is China needs to settle that inland west. It's a restive, challenging population, to put it diplomatically. And China wants to consolidate it, to control it. So pushing more and more industry in there, hydroelectric, solar, tomatoes, cotton, fish farms, is one way to settle it. That's part of the big agenda. The other agenda is China put 30% of its aquaculture along its, 30% of its eastern coast is taken up by aquaculture. Extremely polluting and extremely overfished. So those waters have plummeted. So they need to figure out how to decrease the pressure of that their industry is doing on their own coasts. How? Move inland. Where? Move to depopulated inland. Where's that? Far west. Thirdly, there's a great PR story of Chinese ingenuity, Chinese state-led ingenuity, that it's eager to push. Look at what we've done with solar. Look at what we're doing on climate. All commendable and impressive, but also part of the China PR program to show that Xinjiang isn't a human rights story, it's an innovation story, it's an engineering story. Growing fish in the desert is a great engineering story, right? And so they're pushing that on social media. These are the big reasons they're pushing inland.
And you're testifying here saying that some of the seafood is reaching the United States, reaching public institutions. Where is the biggest enforcement failure here? Is it the importer due diligence? Is it customs screenings? And what is it that we can do better to try to verify? To be able to push back on this and be able to have credible ways for certification bodies to be able to verify the labor and sustainability claims from that region.
Sorry to do this to Dean again, but the nuts and bolts of how UFLPA works, how withhold release orders work, are super important here. Oftentimes it's how slow it is, the bar of evidentiary standard for getting a company added. These are some of the biggest reasons that those two tools alone aren't more effective. I think that's one place. Funding, staff levels, how the law is being interpreted and how recent the testimony has to be, what level of proof is required for forced labor. UFLPA, luckily, you don't need that. If you're from Xinjiang, it's proven. But for other places on ships, very tough. These are the things that are boring, but also super consequential in how effective it can be. I think the biggest issues are the ones that I focus on, which is putting the responsibility less on your shoulders and less on Customs and Border and the executive, and putting it back more on industry, due diligence, and having them prove that it's not happening. They're the ones that are making the money off of it. They should also have the burden. They also are in command of their own supply chains. We have to fight and go out to sea and do all sorts of crazy things to figure out their supply chains. They're sitting on the data. And if they wanted to police their own supply chains, if they were forced to, they could. But right now they don't have to. And China makes it especially easy because they can throw up their hands and say, well, it's certified by best aquaculture practices or whomever, so we think that's pretty good. But if you ask them, does anyone actually, what does that mean? They say, well, you should ask them, and we do the best we can in China. Those are the places where I think the biggest fixes have to happen, and putting pressure on industry to fix that and requiring them to do so is probably the biggest thing that you folks could do.
Well, thanks for shining a light on this, and for the three of you, just the incredibly important information that we have, and I hope we can take real action here to be able to step up and stop some of the most nefarious aspects of this and be able to get things better for our fishermen in New Jersey and elsewhere. So thanks so much for putting this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Kim. I'm going to go to round two here. We do have a vote, so we're going to keep this kind of quick, but I want to begin. Admiral, your testimony, I want to ask two questions. You testified that MSAFE created a framework but is under-resourced and underutilized. Where do you think the principal breakdown in that is with regard to MSAFE funding, interagency coordination, operational capacity, and then related to that, so we're hoping to get my Fish Act over the goal line here soon, and that does have a big role for our great men and women in the Coast Guard. I chair the Coast Guard Subcommittee and the Commerce Committee. What kind of specific resources do you think we need to make the Coast Guard more efficient at meeting IUU fishing interdiction goals? You may have seen in the Working Families Tax Cuts Act, last year we made the biggest investment in the Coast Guard in American history, $25 billion. Huge. 22 new cutters, 16 new icebreakers, 40 new H-60 helos. I mean, we are investing massively in the Coast Guard. But are there other Coast Guard related priorities that can help on the IUU fishing front? So 2 questions for you.
Well, thank you very much for those questions, Senator, and they're very important. So on the MSAFE, again, it's a very laudable effort. It's the only of its kind, and it brings together departments and agencies in a very unique way. We've talked about the complexity, and it's outside of the Coast Guard wheelhouse, but of customs enforcement and traceability. You look at a Jade Spear type investigation, it involved many departments and agencies, and that requires very, very detailed and intricate work between the departments and agencies. As I compare the MSAFE to other work that I've done at the national level, when I think about some of the efforts I had as National Security Council, and we were working on a strategy in Central America that was routinely briefed at the cabinet level, and then I also had the opportunity to work transnational organized crime in the strategic division that was also briefed at the cabinet level. I look at an incredible opportunity here with your Fish Act, with the MSAFE that's already established, with the President's EO that addresses having to get after importation of IUU fishing. It connects us to both the executive branch and the legislative branch, and resources can be brought to the table. The one thing I would say is when we work in the MSAFE, we can't just be cataloging everything that we're already doing. Those efforts have to focus on what needs to be done, and that sometimes involves changing what agencies are doing, changing their emphasis and funding additional lines of effort, and that's hard work. So having routinely report to Congress and the executive branch on how to get ahead using the MSAFE and all these, this is the time to do it. I think this is the time to rejuvenate all the efforts against IUU.
Great. I'm going to ask a final question for Mr. Pinkert and Mr. Urbina. It's kind of they're related, but you might have different angles from it. But it's essentially, if we wanted to have measurable either from the Congress or the executive branch results in this area in the next 12 months, where would you focus the efforts? Tougher import enforcement, stronger procurement bans, pressure on certifiers, exposure of brands using these supply chains and slave labor, entity list designations. Hopefully my bill is going to have the sanctions list component to it when it becomes law, a Section 301 investigation. Like, where would you, maybe it's not one to just prioritize, but to get action and, to be honest, to get publicity on the importance of this, which you have all done a really good job at. Where would you think in the next 12 months the most effective, impactful action that we, either in the Congress or the executive branch, could take? We've been working with USTR. They're looking at a 301 investigation. I think they're already undertaking part of the investigation aspects. So I think we're pushing on an open door with this administration on a lot of this. But I'm just curious, from your expertise, where would you prioritize efforts? Why don't we start with you?
So thank you. I would note that the Seafood Competitiveness Executive Order specifically talked about using Section 301.
Yeah.
And I would just add to that, of course, this bifurcation of supply chains issue is a really, really critical aspect of that, and they should really be looking into that. As far as other things, you mentioned the entity list, and I think we need to kind of set the scene for the difficulties that have occurred in the last year or so with the entities list and the fact that there's just not much movement in that area. This is a interagency group, 7 agencies and some observer agencies as well. And it's chaired by the DHS, and there's been a lot of turnover among staff. There's been a lot of turnover among the political appointees that are charged with keeping this program going and keeping it robust. And quite frankly, we don't know what the priority is in terms of having robust additions to the entity list. So I think that, Ian talked a lot about the problem of labor transfers within China, and in fact, one of his former colleagues, Daniel Murphy, has also written quite a bit about that. And in order to really address labor transfers, we have to get the entity list up and moving forward. And then finally, civil penalties. That's a totally I don't want to say totally neglected, but mostly neglected area of authority. You've got to make companies pay. Ian talked about the TVPRA and the venture liability under the TVPRA. These companies are in a venture making money off of forced labor in many instances, and we need to make them accountable, not just in terms of shaming, but also financial penalties. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Urbina, I'll give you the last word, then I'm going to turn it over to Chairman Smith to wrap up the hearing. I am being called by the cloakroom to get down and vote, but I want to hear your final answer. You have a lot of views on this, I'm sure, and want to hear them.
I'll be very brief. I think what Dean said is 100% correct. It's a sort of bottom-up strategy. I think a top-down strategy would be, the civil penalties point is akin, but I think focusing on the certification industry and also the largest single corporate players, be they grocers or seafood companies, that the U.S. government relies on to provide its seafood in lots of different places, and figuring out to what degree those players alone, through purchasing policy, can be pressured to change how well they police their supply chains by way of demands from you folks. If you want access to this market, then you've got to change your approach to verifying to us that you're not tied to these regions. I think that will affect the marketplace globally and have trickle-down effects that are more efficient than legislation sometimes.
Great. Well, listen, I want to thank the witnesses. I'm going to turn it over to Chairman Smith here. Excellent testimony as we wrap up. If other members of the commission have additional questions, they will submit them to the record, for the record to all of you. And if you can try to get answers back to those other members in the next 2 weeks, and we'll leave the hearing record open. But again, I want to thank the outstanding witnesses, all 3 of you, and the importance of this hearing. I think it's gaining steam in the executive branch, in the Congress, in a bipartisan way, and I think that's really positive. Your work, all 3 of you, has been exceptional, and we really appreciate it. Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you, sir, and we will be in touch.
Thank you. I want to thank Chairman Sullivan. Just to underscore, we have a vote now over on the House side, so I'm going to have to leave it momentarily. But I want to thank you for your testimonies, for your guidance, your wisdom, counsel, breakthrough work. But just to underscore how historic and how difficult it is to get anything passed of this caliber. I've had the Forced Organ Harvesting Act passed 406 to 1 in the House. It has passed in the last Congress, passed in this one. I can't get it passed here in the Senate. I mean, it's an abomination what Xi Jinping is doing to the Uyghurs, to the Falun Gong, and to others. Tens of thousands of young people, average age 28, having their organs ripped out from, killed. My first hearing on forced organ harvesting was 30 years ago. In 1996, I had a doctor who actually testified as to exactly what they're doing. It was a low-level exploitation and human rights abuse then in terms of numbers, but now it's industrial size, and I can't get the bill out of the Senate. So I want you to know how important and precedent-setting it is for the chairman to have gotten his bill on the Fish Act passed in the Senate. It was a brilliant maneuver on his part. He got it, and it will pass in the House, I guarantee it. So I just, I hope people realize that. Otherwise, we'd have another great bill sitting and languishing in committee and never moves. But now we have a real good, solid, actionable piece of legislation that he has authored. I know that there are some 30 entities list proposals that have not gone forward. I'm not sure if any of them deal with seafood. Maybe Mr. Pinkert, you might know. But we do need, and I think the chairman and part of the answer just a moment ago was that there's been a lot of change of personnel and the like. But we need to get a more laser-like focus on doing just that. And implementation. And when this bill becomes law in the Fish Act, similarly, implementation. And then I have to run. Anybody want to? But I can't thank you enough. I mean, you have done breakthrough work, all three of you, and the chairman has done, I think, the biggest heavy lift imaginable to get it passed in the U.S. Senate.
Thank
You
you.
have a vote, so I'm going to have to leave. But the hearing is adjourned, and I thank you.
Thank you.